Hello and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. We continue exploring today the section on misdeeds and what to avoid. So these sentences state to avoid oppressing subordinates for one's personal gain and flattering superiors to curry favour. So clearly there are two ideas here, but they are linked, and they refer to our professional relationships. So it refers to this idea of professionalism. And this kind of professional relationship is something that we will all encounter. So what happens in our workplace, in any kind of position where we might have someone who is an expert, or we are in an inferior position in the sense that we have to answer to someone else. So what's happening in these, what the Exalted Treatise is talking about is that in this professional relationship, the person with more authority and power is really exploiting their subordinate, taking advantage of the other person because of their authority. And this is because the person in power is thinking only of their interests. So their own personal needs, interests, whether that might be emotional, financial, or otherwise. It does sort of, we might take a step back here and think about, well, why does this occur? This is very common, and once people have power and privilege, this is a slippery slope. It sometimes happens. Why is that? Well, looking at a very interesting book called The Elements of Ethics for Professionals by Johnson and Ridley, they refer to Abraham Maslow's theory of human motivation, and the fact that everyone has this need for self-esteem, to be respected. But even though this need for self-esteem is something that's quite innate to all humans, that need can be satisfied in various ways. So it could be through internal sources of motivation or external sources of motivation. Now, what's the difference? So internal sources, so if we derive a sense of achievement through inner confidence, a sense of mastery, and a sense of just acknowledging within ourselves that we have become more skilled, then this is what Maslow would call an internal source of motivation, that we can feel it within ourselves. And certainly there's a very famous quote in which Confucius says that he doesn't need the praise of others. He knows within himself that his own achievements and his own learning brings him much of joy and pleasure. So that's the other. So this is now the other source of motivation, the external source, in which our sense of achievement is derived from the recognition of others. So everyone, yes, we all enjoy being respected, recognized, admired, but when it comes from someone else, when this respect is through fame, glory, status, reputation, then that actually becomes an ethical vulnerability, in the sense that that external source of motivation leads to a slippery slope, because it's never enough. The more you have, the more you want. And also what happens is that people often stop at nothing to get that additional sense of respect and recognition. So they'll do anything to achieve that acclaim. Now, this is where the learning comes in, right? So part of our learning, when we read these classical texts of the Chinese thought traditions is that we have to be attuned to our ethical vulnerabilities. So when we read these statements, misdeeds X, Y, Z, then we need to reflect on the fact that what's happening here? Is this something that, on a subtle level, reflects a need for prestige, and then in my life, with the people that I interact with, and how I interact with them? If I am in a position where I'm have more expert knowledge and skills or more authority, then do I use that to exploit them, take advantage of them for my own prestige? So, in other words, we have to evaluate our inner thoughts when we deal with others. And these thoughts are very subtle sometimes. It's as subtle as just simply claiming the credit for someone else's ideas. It could just be one idea. And you claim that credit because you want to look good for the people around you, your own boss or superior. So this idea of oppressing subordinates for gain is really taking credit where it's undeserved at a very subtle level. And then obviously there are other forms, for example, fraudulent behavior, etc. But then how does that first sentence relate to the second? Why are they put together? Because the common denominator is this dishonesty, isn't it? The other side of the coin, so first you take undeserved credit, but the other side of the coin is actually when you give undeserved credit, you give praise where it's not due. So you're flattering others where it's not necessary, where it's not deserved. Why? For the same intentions, for your own personal gain, for your own personal, for your own self-interest. So dishonesty here is the common denominator. And reading these texts really remind us of all of these subtle thoughts that we might have underneath the surface of our various interactions and communications. And the great thing about constantly coming back to these classical texts is that it gives us guidelines. So Confucian thought provides us with really good guidelines on how these professional relationships should be, how we should fulfill our responsibilities and our roles within them. So this professional relationship would be, in Confucian speak, the leader and team member relationship. So it was conceptualized in the past as the relationship between the sovereign and subject, particularly in imperial, but also in pre-imperial China. The picture on the right-hand side is Emperor Qianlong of the Qing dynasty. So in that picture you can see someone who was in a position that was really the highest position in the entire Chinese kingdom, and that sense of importance. And then, this was often what people might have thought of the Asian conception of a leader, that there was absolute power. And certainly even in pre-imperial times, if you look at the map at the bottom, so 5th century BCE, around the time of when Confucius was alive, when he thought about and conceptualized these different ethical ideas, you can see that China was very much divided into various feudal domains. And in these feudal domains had their own rulers who were meant to be accountable to the Zhou king, the king who was the leader of this confederation of states. So in that period of time, the leaders could also be those who were ruling the states, not just the so-called son of heaven, the Zhou king. And then their higher, the senior ministers and their junior ministers would then also have this kind of leader, team member kind of relationship. So it actually happens across every part of society, and particularly even ever relevant to today's society, thinking about, what's the relationship between your line manager and yourself, the boss and the subordinate, the leader and the team member of any group. It doesn't have to be some sort of employment. And we can think about that in relation to these Confucian ideas for our own lives. When we think about and oftentimes when people think of this Confucian idea or these Chinese Asian concepts of the leader as someone with absolute power, it can be quite misleading. In the last over a decade now, Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont Jr. have provided us with a very fresh perspective on the Confucian philosophy, in the sense that they talk about it as a vision of a role ethics, Confucian role ethics. So the fact is that to become an ethical person, to really develop ourselves and our human potential, is through the relationships that we have in our lives. And no person really exists as an island. We all exist within a web of interpersonal relationships. The moment that we're born, we have the parent and child relationship. We're within a family. We might have siblings, etc., etc. So in this idea of the Confucian role ethics, this theory, yes, we're individuals, but we don't exist alone. And this self, our identity, is defined as the sum total of all of our different roles and relations. So the very fundamental, basic 5 categories of relationships are here in this small diagram. So first of all, the parent and child relationship, the leader and team member relationship, between siblings, younger and older, between spouses, and between friends. But from these 5 basic categories come all other extended relationships, like extended family, etc. But what it's trying to tell us is that that within these relationships we really develop ourselves, and we need each other. And this is the same in the leader and team member relationship. So it's not a power relationship, it's actually an interdependent relationship. So rather than thinking about the boss and the employee as a hierarchical relationship, even though oftentimes it is the case when you look at the organizational chart, Rosemont Jr. and Ames challenge us and explain that Confucius challenges us to think of these relationships as benefactors and beneficiaries. Now, what does that mean? It means that in any relationship, there's give and take. Right? When we're giving, we're the benefactor. When we're taking, we're the beneficiary. That's different from a hierarchical relationship, where it seems that the person who's got more power is the person that gets to have the say. This one is more dynamic. So in any time of the day or in different situations, different projects, the leader and the team member swap between being benefactor and beneficiary. So it's what they call associated living and this interdependency. From a philosophical point of view, it's also called a dualistic monism. Now, what does that mean? Dualism means two. So there's 2 parties in that relationship, or as you can see in the picture here, there's 5 members in that team, but there's a monism. Mono meaning one, and this oneness is when the team works together. So when the leader and the team member have to work together as one. It looks like 2, but they're working together because they have a shared goal. And what is this shared goal? It's the cultivation of their character. So regardless of whether you're the leader or the team member, the main overarching priority is the same: to cultivate oneself and one's virtue, to develop your human potential. And they need each other. The 2 parties need each other to help in this project of developing oneself. And it's interesting because this cultivation of character, this goal was over and above even organizational goals of material profits. Right? So character was considered much more important than profit in this shared goal. And this was very well illustrated by a quote from the Highest Learning, one of the 4 books of Confucian learning, which explains very logically the why is virtue, why is character so fundamental. Because if one has character, particularly as a leader, then one will attract the right people. People who are also hardworking, diligent, honest. And these human resources are necessary because regardless of what project or what event, what organization we have, we need people. We can't do it alone. So the appointment of others and this we call recruitment of human resources is based on the culture of the organization, which is set. The culture is set, or you could say it's the leader that sets the tone for that organizational culture. So once the leader has virtue, then they will attract the right people. And through the people working together, then one attains the material resources, these assets. So in those times, they were talking about land because it was an agrarian society, which agriculture was the main industry, you could say, in the sense that if you had the people, then yes, you could till the fields. People would have their food. This very important resource. But also, when people are strong, working together, then the territory can expand. So this land was not just the fields, but also one's territory. And with that territory, with that land, comes wealth. So the income, the returns, etc., from a modern perspective. So with wealth, one has means. So this means is the means to continue consolidating and expanding and developing. So you see that from the beginning, the most important thing is that character. And as it says, virtue is the root, wealth is the branch. The metaphor of the tree. Without the roots, you can't have the fruits. So the roots are the most important part of the tree that need to be watered and nurtured. And the rest naturally takes care of itself. Wealth, the branch, means that, of course, it's just going to happen. The tree's going to grow, but you have to make sure that the roots are well fertilized, well nourished, and watered. So the focus of your attention is the roots. The focus of our attention is cultivation, whether it's for the leader or the team member. And when they're both cultivating the virtue, their character, then the rest happens naturally. Reputation, glory, fame, wealth, etc. So that's the branches. In this diagram, it makes it clearer. It's kind of a flowchart, isn't it? The very beginning, the virtue, which is the top priority, and the secondary things that come after are people, land, wealth, means, etc. And because something like the Highest Learning was core curriculum, it meant, of course, that this was there was shared awareness of these priorities for both leaders and team members, so for sovereign and ministers in Imperial China. So you can see that we can already start to reconceptualize this professional relationship, that actually both are working towards the same goal, and it's the goal of cultivation. And this is very, very clear when we look at the Analects, the words of Confucius. One time, one of the leaders of the ruling families in the state of Lu, Confucius's home state, asks him and consults him about governing, which is really just that idea of leadership. So asks him, how is it that I can be a good leader? how does Confucius reply? He says, governing means being upright, having good character. If you are able to lead with good character, then everyone else will just follow suit. In other words, he's motivating Ji Kangzi to set a moral example, to be the role model, and set the tone for the rest of the government. And notice, of course, that Confucius, in this idea of leadership and governing, doesn't mention anything about managing others, supervising others, or even controlling, manipulating others with some sort of strategy and scheming. Confucius turns the focus not on who is being governed, how to manipulate and manage the subordinates, the ministers and the people, but turns it back on Ji Kangzi and says the leader has to work on themselves. That's number one priority. So in the heading here, it talks about the leader as a benefactor. Yes, the leader is a benefactor because they are the ones giving out the jobs, the titles, the ranks, the salaries. They have the means to other people's fame and fortune. But notice how Confucius doesn't mention that. He mentions that the leader is a benefactor through their example, through their moral character. And that's really one of the definitional statements of leadership from Confucian perspective, and it really was the foundation of Confucius's political philosophy. But the leader is not just the benefactor. They are also a beneficiary in the sense that they need their team. And this is an extract from the school sayings of Confucius. Again, the words of Confucius, a very famous proverb or idiom at the beginning, which he says that effective medicine is often bitter. I don't know if anyone here has tried traditional Chinese herbal soup medicines before, but yes, they are often bitter, but they are also quite effective in the sense that it cures the disease. Now, the first sentence is actually just a metaphor. So what is it saying? Confucius is trying to tell us that oftentimes honesty, honest words, and sometimes criticism is not something we want to hear, but they're necessary for us to improve, particularly as the leader. If the strategy is wrong, we need to have the information. We need to hear the reports and the data in order to make informed decisions about how to change the course of this organization. So truthful words, like the medicine, may not want to take it, we may not want to accept it, but it's something that is important and also effective. But where do these truthful words come from? From the ministers, from the team. So the Confucius then provides an example, exemplars in history. Prior to his time, King Tang of the Shang dynasty, King Wu of the Zhou dynasty, they led their dynasties, their states, to peace and prosperity. Why? Because they were able to accept and take on board this criticism. And extensively from all sides means that they didn't just listen to the people around them, the most important ministers, but even from the commoners. So they accepted feedback from everyone. On the other hand, very infamous leaders, King Jie of the Xia dynasty, King Zhou of the Shang dynasty, so again prior to the times of Confucius, they only listened to agreeable words. So they only listened to people who agreed with them and said and flattered them. And what happened? Well, not only did this lead to their own downfall, the end of their rulership, but also ultimately the end of their dynasty. So the leader, yes, the leader is seems to have that power and prestige and authority, but that is dependent on who's around them, providing them with objective evaluations, keeping the checks and balances on them so that they can sustain that authority. So in this Confucian setting, we can see already that the leader has an interdependent relationship with the team member. And this is also expressed by Xunzi, who lived after Confucius, but was very important in developing and defending Confucian thought. He explains that the enlightened ruler, so these effective leaders, they're fond of having people to collaborate with them, to provide them with different ideas, and maybe even oppose their ideas, because it means, of course, that there's this, that caters to different people, and you are aware of what's happening beyond your own thoughts, and people just agree with you. But the benighted ruler is fond of ruling alone. Now, what does this ruling alone mean? It doesn't mean that they're the only one in the organization. No, it means that they only want to hear their own voice, and they are the ones calling the shots, and they're not listening to anyone else. So they're not ruling alone in the sense that they do everything, but they get everyone else to do everything. And if anyone opposes them, then that person has to face punishment or something like that. So this is the benighted ruler here is really the autocrat, isn't it? But very interestingly, in the classical scholarship, this classical Confucian scholarship tells us that's not the case. We need to learn from the enlightened ruler. The enlightened ruler honors the worthy, employs the capable, and really celebrates their achievements. So honoring the worthy actually means respecting the worthy and making sure that they are listened to, they have positions that are suitable to their virtue and their capabilities. So, you don't have a very, capable person in a junior position being supervised by someone who is incapable and therefore incapable of recognizing their skills. So it has to be that they have to have the right position, the right title and rank and authority, so that they can really use their skills for the benefit of the leader and also the people. So the enlightened ruler knows to do this, whereas the benighted ruler, on the other hand, is really jealous of the worthy. Now, the worthy here is not just being worthy for the position, but refers to that character, the virtue. So, in other words, the benighted ruler is jealous of those who are virtuous. Now, that might seem quite strange, because aren't the virtuous kind people? They would be people that everyone would find very nice to have around. But on the other hand, this benighted ruler who only thinks of themselves would feel jealous and annoyed because the person who's more virtuous makes them look bad. They fear the capable because, again, that would make them look bad for not being capable themselves, for not being virtuous themselves. And therefore, this kind of leader will take credit for their subordinates' work and destroy their merit. In other words, not give them any credit, and in fact, may even dismiss them, not have them around. So there's this difference here, isn't it? But you can see that the enlightened leader is the one that we should learn from, and that leader acts as a beneficiary, that they recognize that they are benefiting and learning from the people around them. And so they constantly maintain that humility, they learn, they grow, and they develop, most importantly, their character. The million-dollar question then is, well, how to determine who you should have around? Who is worthy and has that virtue? If we want to benefit from our team, well, we need to make sure we select the right people for this team, isn't it? So how do we do it? How do we judge others? And it goes back to that original chart where it said that virtue is the foundation. We have to work on ourselves. We have to cultivate and make cultivation our priority. The focus is not on judging others, but on working on ourselves. And what happens is that if we're heading in the right direction, we will find travelers along the way and people who are also heading in that direction. And if we change, so the change has to start within ourselves. If we change, then others around us will respond to our sincerity, to our genuineness. It's not waiting for others. It's actually starting from ourselves. So it goes back to the very beginning of the Exalted Treatise, which says that good fortune, and good fortune can be in the form of, virtuous people, teachers, etc., that you happen to meet. How do we have such good fortune? Well, it is because of our own thoughts, words, and actions. So this good fortune, based on our own good deeds, our own good thoughts, kind thoughts, follows us like a shadow follows its form and an echo follows the sound. So the first thing is the form, the response is the shadow, the sound has to come from us before there's the echo. So we create our own destiny. So we don't need to worry if we're not perfect in our cultivation, as long as we're heading in the right direction, as long as our thoughts are based on these teachings, that we constantly evaluate ourselves, then we are going to meet fellow travelers who will help us along the way. And this reminds me of a very famous story of the Thousand-League Horse, and it's about a story about a king who buys a dead horse for 500 gold pieces. Oh, why did this happen? Well, one time this ancient king was wanting to attain a 1,000-league horse. Now, a 1,000-league horse was a very rare breed of horse, in the sense that they could travel 1,000 leagues or 1,000 sort of miles in one day. In other words, they could travel very fast. The modern equivalent would be a fast car, right? So in those days, these kinds of horses were very hard to come by. And this ancient ruler was very keen to attain one. So he said that he would give out a reward of 1,000 gold pieces for anyone who could bring him one of these 1,000-league horses. But 3 years passed, and no one had offered any form of a horse to him. So, after some time, he sort of complaining to one of his ministers, and this minister says, well, don't worry, give me some time, and I'll go out and find you this horse. After 3 months, the minister returns back. But he returns with the remains of a horse. And on top of that, he's used 500 gold pieces to buy this horse on behalf of the ruler. So you can imagine that this king is absolutely furious. I asked for a 1,000-league horse, and you brought me back a dead one. And on top of that, you paid for it. So, but the official says, let me explain. What your Lord is suffering from is that people don't trust you. Imagine if they bought one. They happen to find the very rare 1,000-league horse, and they bring this horse to you, but they're not sure whether or not you're going to actually give them the reward, or you're just going to use your power and authority to not keep your side of the bargain. So he says, by buying this dead 1,000-league horse with the 500 gold pieces, you're essentially letting everyone know across the kingdom that you are in the market for a horse and you're serious. And so the deal, it's almost a done deal. You're going to get one. And sure enough, within the space of a year, this king attains 3,000-league horses, these very rare horses. So this story is actually used by a very wise master, Guo Wei, who advises King Zhao of the state of Yan. And this is because King Zhao at that time, in the Warring States period, had just returned to and could sort of say taken back his country, the state of Yan, from the state of Qi, who had invaded. Okay, so he's trying to reinstate, consolidate, rebuild his state. And in order to do so, he knows that he needs worthy ministers. He needs people to help him, the human resources, as we said. But he needs to find virtuous, capable, and talented people. And he's just wondering how he's going to do this. So he asks and consults Guo Wei, who tells him the story and says, you really need to show people that you're serious. It's not just, you can't just issue some sort of decree and expect people to come. You have to show people, be the example. In other words, you have to start respecting anyone who has any semblance of virtue or character or capability right here and right now. He says, well, I'll sacrifice myself. Why don't you start with me? You can start by showing respect to me as a kind of worthy official. And so King Zhao takes this advice on board. And what he does, he buys a big house for Guo Wei. He, consults him every day, addresses him and respects him as a teacher. And then very, very shortly, the worthy, capable talent from across the Chinese kingdom, from other states, comes to the state of Yan and leads this state to become quite powerful at that time. So the story, the bottom line here is really to say that the leader needs that leadership team, the ministers, say the right human resources, but how to achieve that is through the leader's own genuineness. So that sincerity to buy that horse has to come through and has to be shown. So you don't look for worthy talent or the right people, you attract them through your own cultivation, through your own character and your own sincerity. Now, let's turn to the role of the subordinate. So in this relationship, we said it's interdependent. It's not a power relationship. It's an interdependent relationship, but certainly, of course, the subordinate is a beneficiary by right of the fact that they are employed by the leader. So as it says here in Xunzi, what's their role? Well, they have to follow instructions. They have to be respectful, reverent, be humble, be very clear about the instructions they receive. Check if they're not sure. And when they're sure about what needs to be done, their particular responsibility, carry it out with diligence. And then not allow one's own personal or private interests to get in the way, in the sense of, should I do this because I don't want to do this because it would mean that I would have to do extra work, etc. Well, that's your own private consideration. Don't let that get in the way of the work that's been set. And more importantly, if you happen to have some delegated authority, for example, in selecting, promoting others, granting them some sort of benefit, then you can't do so on the basis of your own preferences of, whether this person is my friend, my ally, but to do so within the remit of what your boss or your manager has set, in the sense that, they're trying to select people with certain skills, and your job is to determine their competence, not to determine whether they will be your ally or not. So that's quite easy to understand. And as it says here, to take one's goal as obedience to the rules and intentions. But there is a caveat here. And the caveat is that we only do this if we are serving someone who is sagely. And sagely meaning someone who is themselves cultivating or is cultivated in their character. So that's when the subordinate is very much in that you would say role where they take on the instructions, follow the instructions carefully, and make sure they see them through. That is in the service of someone who has this clear judgment and objective evaluation of the entire situation, a sage lord, as it says here. But the subordinate is still very much a benefactor. They're also giving. Okay? So it says here, yes, they have to be loyal and trustworthy, but they can't do everything that their boss needs, particularly if it's just for the whim of their leader, for their own sort of personal interests, for the leader's personal interests. Where that's the case, they have to make sure that they provide honest feedback, contest, as in oppose some ideas, and not flatter, so not be a sycophant. They have to be very resolute. Their intentions have to be correct in terms of, they're doing it for the improvement of the leadership team, for the improvement of the organization as a whole, and not, think about themselves. And if they can do that, then certainly what they say, what they call out to be right, should be right. If it is right, they'll say it is right. And if it's wrong, they'll say it's wrong. There's no in between where it's like, okay, well, based on my own personal, because I feel that if I was to say something, then my own employment would be threatened, then they feel that they need to cover up. Well, the subordinate's responsibility in this particular description as a benefactor is that they should call out what is right and what is wrong. And that is when they are serving someone who's, what it says here, a mediocre lord, someone who's really not cultivated. What's important to note is that this mediocre lord, or the sage lord, doesn't have to be two people, could be the same person. And how might that be the case? Well, in different situations, your leader may be more partial or impartial than others. So, oftentimes the leader might be very objective when they're evaluating reports, evaluating the works of others. But when it comes to maybe their pet project, a strategy that they put forward themselves, then they may be more partial. And it's in those times that this role of subordinate has to kick in the sense that we have to think about remonstrating, contesting, etc., and not giving into flattery. So that would be, as the Exalted Treatise told us, not to flatter our superiors, to curry favour. And that's important because, as it says here, the role of the subordinate is quite dynamic. Yes, we have to take on board instructions, but only if those instructions will not be to the detriment of the leader themselves or the overall organization and community. So in this case, the subordinate really has to provide accurate, complete information, try to provide that objectiveness so that decisions can be made. The idea of a worthy subordinate versus an unworthy subordinate, it comes out quite clearly in this idea that Confucius says in the Analects. So one time his student Zilu asks Confucius about how to serve one's leader. So we have to remember that Confucius's students came from all walks of life, and some were actually quite senior. And Confucius, in his learning, in this kind of teaching, he didn't expect his students to, become philosophers and just merely discourse about the world and life, etc. But he expected them and hoped they would go on to be employed as leaders of the state themselves, as government officials. So Zulu is one of these students who then goes on to be a leader himself. And so in this particular instance, he's coming back to ask his master, well, how do I use what you've taught me, this philosophy, to really serve my boss and ultimately serve the state? And Confucius, in his reply, doesn't talk about, you have to listen to everything, you have to be really meticulous. What he says is directly to the point. The other thing is a given. As a subordinate, yes, you have to listen, but you should never deceive your leader. You have to be honest. And you have to be able to have the courage to oppose them when it's necessary, and particularly when it is in opposition to the popular views at that time. Maybe everyone in court is agreeing with the leader because that's the most convenient thing to do. But if it is something that is detrimental to the state, to the leadership team, to the leader, then you have to be able to stand up for the principles. So this is what Confucius particularly points out in serving one's leader. The next story then explains it very clearly, that why it is that one should do this, because ultimately it's actually helping others is helping oneself. You'll see this in the story. So this occurs in the spring and autumn period in the state of Chu. The ruler of the state of Chu, King Wen, is quite ill, and he's in this period of illness. It makes him think about succession. It makes him sort of reflect on what's happening around him and in the state of government affairs, right? And so, after and during this time, he tells his officers that he's really gone through some deep pondering and thinking. He says, there's two officers that I've turned my mind to in this period of time. First one is Guan Rao. And Guan Rao, he's the kind of person who's very principled, often sort of objects to things that I say, might criticize me, but always, according to the ritual law, the ritual traditions. So he's, whatever he says, he backs it up with evidence. But because he's very honest and also very principled, I often feel quite uncomfortable when I'm around Guan Rao. Because I always feel that, maybe there's something that he might criticize about me. And therefore, if I'm not around him, I actually don't miss him. But actually, I realize now, when on reflection, that I benefit from his advice. So as a result, you must promote him, give him a proper title and rank. As for my other close aide, the Marquis of Shin, this is someone who does what I say, always agrees with me, acknowledges and praises me, makes me feel important, it makes me feel good about myself. And so as a result, when I'm around him, we get along really well, I'm quite at ease, and I actually miss his company on the days that he's not at court, because I don't get that sense of recognition from others as much. But on reflection, when I follow through on his advice, and really it's really supporting my own personal whims, then I encounter difficulties, I suffer setbacks when I take his advice. And on reflection, I think you really should send him away. So the officers, of course, do this. Guan Rao gets promoted, and the Marquis of Shin is sent away. And interestingly, the rest of the story tells us that, because King Wen feels very close to the Marquis, prior to sending him away, he sort of meets him for one last time, gives him a very precious jade and tells him that, look, these are the things that you have to avoid. You are the kind of person who tends to monopolize authority. But, because you get in the good books of the leader, then, I will overlook that. But that might not be the case when you go to some other state. So you have to be careful of this. So he tells the Marquis not to go to some of the larger states because they might not be able to tolerate your habits, this power for prestige and authority. And what happens is that the Marquis doesn't listen, and he ultimately goes to the state of Jin, and at that state he again ingratiates himself with the leader, sort of monopolizes authority, and within months the Marquis is assassinated, because it is as King Wen predicted. Basically, others would not be able to tolerate him. So you can see, of course, that what it's telling us is that the leader and the team member, they depend on each other, but each also has to fulfill their own roles in the sense of really cultivating themselves. And if they don't, then it doesn't mean that the other party loses out, but they themselves lose out because they don't change, and they don't improve. And then as a result, it means that they run into difficulties later down the track, regardless of who is their leader or their team member. So the story is quite a chilling example of what would happen without those checks and balances in place. So the leader and the subordinate relationship from the Confucian perspective is very interesting. It's not the kind of power relationship that we think about. Someone at the top is the person with the most authority, etc., who sort of controls everyone below them. Actually, it's very different. It's a dynamic relationship in which both parties have their roles, their responsibilities, but also their obligations to each other. They balance each other out. It's a complementary, interdependent kind of relationship because there's learning on both sides. The leader has to learn and be open to ideas, different views, even though it might be challenging. It might be not as pleasing to the ear, but it might be necessary to make informed decisions. They learn from each other, but this learning is ultimately for the development of the self, of the character. And so together, if everyone in that team, including the leader, is setting this cultivation of character as a priority, then everyone wins. As it says here, leader, team members succeed together, because everything else comes after. You attract the right people, the right talent, capable people, and then with that you have more material resources, assets, and that leads to consolidating growth, expansion. So these principles hold whether it was in the past as it is now. It really helps us to redefine and rethink the leader-subordinate relationship. So when we come back to this particular these ideas in the Exalted Treatise, we have to be really grateful that something, the Exalted Treatise, a very short essay, lists out all the things that we should be attuned to, these inner thoughts. Is this what I'm doing? A subordinate could be anyone. It could be a client, a patient, student, staff members, employees, anyone who you think might be less skilled and has to take your instructions. So what are your thoughts there? Are you thinking about yourself, or are you thinking about growing them and helping them? helping their progress. And then towards people who are more senior than us, are we honest with them, or do we simply flatter for our own personal interests again? So both sides of the coin really help us understand what's happening inside. And if we keep check and evaluate that, then that's really the effectiveness of this learning and the Exalted Treatise. So I'll end there today. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.